Okay, how we doing today, folks? Today, I thought I would just have a little fun and just talk about an IP. So I asked people on Twitter, what they wanted to talk about, and so came back with two video game ones. One was so there were three answers, two video game ones. One was Final Fantasy. The other one was World of Warcraft or Warcraft. Warcraft is one that I do want to talk about on a Writestream because it's an amalgam of many different lore elements that are borrowed from other fantasy franchises. So I go through like all the different ones, like the old gods are borrowed. Everything's borrowed, right? So you could think of it as like Warhammer 40k plus a bunch of stuff. Whereas Final Fantasy, there's no unified world building. Each installment in the franchise is a different story with different sets of world building, and the name, like the caption name Final Fantasy, really isn't referencing a world so much as it's referencing an approach to game making, and it's sort of the flagship product of Square Enix, what's now Square Enix, but was originally Squaresoft. And that flagship product is presenting new ideas, and then their other product, which was Dragon Quest, newest one I think is Dragon Quest 11, which I have, is more in the same world. And so that's an interesting duality that go in there. They have one long-running franchise where they can work on the world building between chapters, and then they have one long-running franchise where everything is new for each installment. And something that started with Final Fantasy, actually I think it started with Final Fantasy 7, but I don't know if they started doing the sequels before Final Fantasy 10. They started doing sequels to installments in the series where they could have these longer arcs without creating, Final Fantasy 10 and 10-2. There's Final Fantasy 13, 13-2, and then 13 Lightning Returns. I never played that one. And so that's something interesting that they've done as they've gone along. But there's a whole lot to talk about that's interesting about Final Fantasy from a writing perspective and from a gaming perspective. And so I thought it might be fun to just chat about them and get people's opinions about some of the Final Fantasy games. So hopefully everything's going good. Not a whole lot of people in the stream this week. That's okay. 35 people. We'll chat and we'll talk about Final Fantasy. So let me start with a couple of things that I think are interesting about Final Fantasy. Is not only do you have a different world that's being explored each time, sometimes you have between installments different approaches to fantasy itself. If you play the original Final Fantasy game, which you can play with an NES emulator, and you can even play the original Final Fantasy 2 and 3 with an NES emulator, but they're going to be, I think, fan translations if you want to play the original Famicom versions, because number 2 and number 3 didn't come out in the US. Starting with that one, you have what would be considered a really typical approach to fantasy and role-playing in terms of the combat. And then kind of put on top of that, you have a really basic story that is set. So one of the things about JRPGs in general and Final Fantasy in particular, come on, we're going to refocus on my face today or what? Okay. One of the things about Final Fantasy in particular, JRPGs in general, is that rather than having a lot of player discretion when it comes to all of your actions in the story and how you direct the story or things like that, you have almost no player control over how the narrative actually happens. The narrative is set, and player choice is left up to how you execute battles, how you optimize and interact with the systems that are involved with battles, and virtually nothing with, say, character development, character choices, those sorts of things. This is in contrast to Western RPGs, which tend to really build on the D&D tradition. And I'll talk a little bit about this in just a second. But the D&D tradition, the role-playing experience is much broader and involves, if you've ever played tabletop RPGs, involves a lot more play that is not just rolling dice and seeing if you hit an enemy. It involves making decisions about how you interact with non-player characters, how you go about interacting with each other in the party as you role play. So Western role-playing tradition, really starting with Dungeons and Dragons, but all the different ones, GURPS, the One Ring role-playing game, which is a more obscure one but a cool one, all the way down to today's 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, the different versions of the D20 system. Of course, GURPS is still around, and then there's lots of people kickstart new RPGs. People have actually asked me if I would do an RPG based on one of my IPs, and it's something that I've considered because it's something that I can actually do and deliver with very little assistance from other people other than artists to produce like a cool book, because of course I want that classic D&D art to be in the book. But the real question about making your own RPG is not just building the world, but building the systems. Once you have Dragon Warrior come out, what was called Dragon Warrior here in the West, and I'm not sure about Europe, but over in Japan it was Dragon Quest, and that series is still going on. What you have is a simplification of the Western role-playing experience so that it fit on a Famicom system and could actually be engaged with by a single player playing a computer. So what they took out, the first thing they took out, was all of the player agency when it came to interacting with the world and generating your own story, and instead put in a narrative, and the player agency is about selecting spells. And I think the original Dragon Warrior, you really only had like 2 or 3 options, which is like run away, attack, or cast a spell. And if you were to play the Alexa version of Skyrim, like the Skyrim Ultra Special Edition for Alexa, it's basically runs like Dragon Quest. It's like, oh no, a skeleton approaches. It's like, do you cast a spell? Do you hit it with your sword? Do you run away? And so you have to decide which one you're going to do. But that kind of set the stage, and when we had the first Final Fantasy game come out, it was called Final Fantasy because they thought they weren't going to make any more games, and it ended up being a big hit. The first Final Fantasy game came out, it was an expansion of those ideas. So a simple story, a choice about what classes you're going to play, and then what actions you're going to make in a battle, and then that leads to basically a loose playing through of a story. And that really forms the bones of what Final Fantasy would build on. Once you get to Final Fantasy IV, what you begin to lose is some of the control over the systems. And you actually start to have a unification of the systems and the story experience. So Final Fantasy IV, which was released on the Super Famicom or Super Nintendo as Final Fantasy II in the West, is one of my very favorite Final Fantasy games, not just for nostalgia, but because of the way it works with this. Your character starts off as like a Dark Knight, and as you progress through the story, your abilities are effective or not effective based on that class there, and then you become a paladin. Like, you go from being a manipulated bad character into a good character, and you become a good class, which is paladin. And as people join or leave your party, they end up with a different class arrangement. So the arrangement of your party is dependent upon where you are in the story, and then the story basically asks you to interact with those classes in different sorts of ways to progress through the story. So it's an interesting meeting of those two. And then after that, you have that which continues to build. Eventually, the classic fantasy settings of yore with Final Fantasy kind of gave way to some mixed settings that involved science fiction. Once you get to Final Fantasy VI and 6, 7, 8 are more what I would call sci-fi fantasy. Maybe you would call it space opera because they're not really in space, but sci-fi fantasy. And then finally, number 9, you take a step back, and it's kind of nostalgia mode for Final Fantasy 2, 3, 4, 5, with that fantasy feel. And Final Fantasy 9 is, again, another one of my favorite ones. Final Fantasy 10, which is more its own weird thing, but mostly fantasy. And then Final Fantasy 11 was an MMO. Final Fantasy 12, again, more classic fantasy, but with some sci-fi elements. So again, that mixture that we had that was so popular in Final Fantasy 6, 7, 8. And then Final Fantasy 13, which is another combination one, a science fiction fantasy. So it's the classic fantasy feel that existed in those early games has kind of given way to something that's a little bit more original, I think. So it's kind of interesting to think about. Let's take a look at some of the chat now that I've given that introduction on how this stuff works. So anyway, before I get to the chat, what makes JRPGs effective is that they are narrative focused. If you were to compare it to a Western RPG, it's like comparing apples to oranges. So if you were to compare Final Fantasy 13 to Skyrim or Oblivion or something like that, it's not a fair comparison. So people have asked me to do reviews on the story from, say, Morrowind. And it's not that the story from Morrowind is bad, but Morrowind is not about the story. Morrowind is about what you choose to do as a player interacting with a world that is intended to feel like it's alive and feel like you are not central to the existence of the world. Morrowind definitely felt that way. Oblivion, you started to get, there's a story you can do where you're the hero, and then Skyrim, it tends to be more about you, the hero. And so that's an interesting thing. But if you compare those two, it's like these other games are not about story. They're about how you interact with the world. So the story is your story, not the game story. And I've talked about this in some content called on my gaming channel, which I need to get back to re-uploading stuff for long-term stuff. I've talked about this stuff before. Let's take a look at some chat. Jared says he's never actually played any of the Final Fantasy games. I've known actually a few people have played the games, but from those who've played the games, they said really good things about them. Yeah. I'm trying to think where a really good place to start is, and probably Final Fantasy IV or Final Fantasy II if you want to play it on a Famicom emulator. It's a really good place to start. It's very easy to understand. If you're not a big gamer, you can navigate the systems really well, and you can even excel at using the systems. Or there was a DS remake a couple years back. Those are good to play. And then I think there's iOS ports of all of those. Final Fantasy VI, I have a lot of nostalgia for. Final Fantasy VII is also a good one to get in on. But once you get to Final Fantasy VII, you start to have the story and the size of the game be so expansive that it's easy to lose track of what the story's doing. And there's several games in the series that the story ends up being kind of convoluted as far as plot goes. And there becomes more player agency, but what you lose is that focus on the narrative. And Final Fantasy IV does it probably better than any of the other games as far as that. I'm a big time fan of the franchise, so I'm pumped to see you guys talking about it. Yeah. Do you play much tabletop stuff? Ian Davies says. I used to. Nowadays I don't play it as much, and there's reasons for that. The first one is it's very time intensive. So I don't have a lot of free time the way it is, right? I have some free time. Most of my free time goes towards work, really. In order to play a tabletop game, you need people to play it with. And so I've moved a lot, and that means I haven't had a consistent group to be able to play any kind of tabletop gaming with in quite a number of years. The other thing is, this is something I've noticed just over the last few years, is the people who get attracted to tabletop gaming as of late, and these are the people who tend to play the newer editions of Dungeons and Dragons, and haven't really played GURPS or some of the other older systems. The D20 is technically that, but a D20 is like a AD&D. AD&D is really my favorite. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2.0 is my favorite version of Dungeons and Dragons. Although there's lots of little things that I could say bad about the systems. They feel really good, and they feel right when you play them. But that tends to be the focus, and it tends to attract people that I just don't really get along with. I'll just put it that way, right? It tends to attract, it's been, the company Wizards of the Coast has been converged by the left. And so everything they put out always has kind of a little left bent. And then a lot of the people who are interested in playing it are just kind of attracted, and they're in that sphere. And I'm not really a lefty, right? I'm a guy on the right. And so I just don't tend to get along that well with those people. And then it tends to be a lot of people, when they're forming up groups, they just don't have a lot of other stuff going on. So they're not interested in playing the game efficiently. So eventually I'll probably find a group that's fun to play with, but I haven't gotten to play a lot of them lately, and that's just where I'm at. Eatwave says a visual novel with a turn-based combat system would be the easiest way to adapt one's own work into an interactive format. I think so. That's a great point. So when you have this, you have a separation of systems and content, right? And that's kind of what JRPGs do. The content, the story, the aesthetics, those are all things that happen. And then you have a system where you battle that becomes the gameplay. So you're separating out the gameplay and the greater content. And there's really nothing wrong with that. In most games, you separate it out a little bit. The gameplay and the content are pretty separate. It's pretty rare that you're able to get them both to happen at the same time, or to make the gameplay the content itself, like make somehow story interaction part of the gameplay, like with Dragon Age Origins or any of the better Bioware RPGs, where they kind of gamify, character relationships and things like that. That's a little bit harder to do, but you're right. I think making a visual novel with turn-based combat system probably the easiest way to adapt it. But I'm talking about tabletop adaptations. I could program a game. That's a lot of extra skills to learn because I haven't done that. But Astral Knight says the Alexa Skyrim edition is real. Yes. So you can tell Alexa, "Hey Alexa, let's play Skyrim," and you can do it. So a game called Final Fantasy is up to 17 now. I feel lied to. yeah. I mean, it just kind of worked out that way. Science Fantasy 8. Yeah, it's kind of science fantasy now. There's nothing wrong with that. They're cool settings. They're very cool settings, and some of them lean more sciencey than others. Final Fantasy 12 to me was very like high fantasy, even though it had airships and like scientists. It didn't feel as like dystopian sci-fi as Final Fantasy 13 did. Not that there's anything wrong with Final Fantasy 13's setting. It's just the way they executed it that I think was not as good as it could have been. Morrowind is king. Yeah, Morrowind. So my favorite Elder Scrolls game is probably Oblivion, and that's because Morrowind has, I think, the best sort of, here's the world and you interact with it. But it has not very good gameplay, in my opinion. I don't think the gameplay is very good. And the systems are okay, but the way you interact with them is not good. Like, combat is bad in Morrowind. And starting the game is annoying. But once you get into it, it's fine. It's good. Oblivion has a much better combat system, and it has still really good RPG systems that interact with it. So the gameplay of Oblivion is better. Now, the character and the interactions with NPCs are not as good, and a lot of that has to do with the decision to voice over everything with like 5 voice actors. But, that's an interesting quirk of Oblivion that I didn't notice the first time I played it. I mean, I noticed that it was the same actors, but I didn't care because full voice acting wasn't as big a thing as it is now, where we'd expect to see 50, 100 different people in it. I never played any Final Fantasy games either. I was never attracted to the over-design. I'm curious to see what is going to be said about it. I don't know what over-design means to you. You're probably, so Max Boyven, if you want to elaborate on what over-design means, that would be great. And in some cases, the design has grown more complex than it ought to be. In other cases, it's really simple. It just depends on how deep you want to go with the games in some cases. Like Final Fantasy 12, you can kind of schlock your way through it, or you can do those hard extra bosses, like if you're an expert and actually know how to manage gambits and control your party well, then there's a lot of depth to it. So they've done a pretty good job with some of the systems. Have you heard of Pathfinder? I've heard of it. Haven't done anything with it. There's more people playing RPGs, Max Boyven, nowadays, but it's harder than ever to find people to play with. Yes, there's too much annoying snowflakes. The signal-to-noise ratio is bad. I think that's kind of how it is. Like, I don't get along with the people who want to RPG, who want to role play as, like, I don't know, some lesbian elf, and then like are hitting on every female NPC. It's kind of like, I don't know. I just don't express fantasy that well, especially the way I write fantasy. I tend to play it the way I want to write it. So I just don't end up getting along playing well with those kinds of people. Their second edition playtest seems to be going the way of D&D. That's Pathfinder. This is what Bruno Corden says. Most Squaresoft RPGs have the main characters go through very specific situations that gradually evolve into world-scale conflicts of cataclysmic proportions. Yeah. A lot of them tend to use hero's journey kind of stuff. And because of the way the gameplay evolves, it kind of reinforces that. So you usually start off a game, any JRPG, but Final Fantasy does this really well. You start off basically not being able to do crap. You can swing your sword and not much else. And as your character grows, your character literally grows and learns new skills and gets better and more powerful as the story requires that character to grow and be more powerful. So that's an interesting way that story and gameplay align in JRPGs or any RPG. Your character gets more powerful, it grows into the hero of the story in a very organic way, and that's by having experiences. And the experiences that the character does, defeating wave after wave of enemy, helps them grow. One of the ones that really felt that way actually was Final Fantasy 13, where the characters are basically terrible when you first play them. You can't do crap with them, and the systems are shallow. The big joke was that it took like 50 hours for the game to actually kick into gear, or some multiple of 10 numbers of hours in Final Fantasy 13 before the game really began. That's because they were so slow at giving you all the systems that you needed. You don't actually get all access to everything, all the spells and all the summons until chapter 12 or 13 in the game, which is the end of the game, right? Your characters are not powerful enough to finish the game until the end of the game. And so that is an interesting way that they work together, and they feel really good together in that way. The problems of Final Fantasy 13 have to do with the forced melodrama and the fact that they didn't really know how to expose the very complex setting that they had designed for it. So you end up being very confused about what the characters are doing, why they're doing it, or even the nature of the world until well into the game. Really, chapter 11 is when you finally figure out what the heck is going on, or chapter 10, the end of chapter 10. And that really is way too much of a time commitment. But at the same time, the gameplay was good enough that most people just kind of kept going with it, even though the story didn't make any sense until they got later in it. So their desire to do all the exposition indirectly ended up confusing people. And they didn't really do the right kinds of info dumps for people to understand what the heck was going on with the story. And then at the end, the last part of Final Fantasy 13, characters seem to act erratically. Like a character comes back from the dead and then he dies immediately. The characters just change their mind about what they're doing and do the opposite of it. And we don't really, when I played it, I'm like, why did we decide to do this? That's probably some flaws in trying to stitch the scenes together. Andromeda was the best Mass Effect. Come on, don't come here to troll Jorge War Crimes. No one liked Mass Effect Andromeda. Best RPG ever played was KOTOR 2. Now that's interesting because KOTOR 2, when it came out, was hated. And it was hated for very good reason. And maybe you weren't around for this, or you weren't in college with a bunch of people who loved KOTOR and loved Star Wars. But KOTOR 2 came out, and it was such a worse experience than KOTOR 1 in terms of the story. People got upset, and what they figured out was that there was whole chunks of the story that were missing from that original release. And you could go on and you could put the disc into your computer, and you could find the cutscenes that they had made for the movie, or made for the game, and never put in because they had to get the game out by Christmas. It was a great example of how a publisher forced, I think Obsidian Entertainment was the one that did it. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Forced a publisher to put a game out ahead of schedule, and the result was bad. Now, nowadays, they'd put it out, and then they'd patch it day one and just kind of do it that way. But boy, it was really hated when it came out. I think I like KOTOR 1. I'd probably have to go back and play KOTOR 2 to actually give it a good assessment these days. Whereas KOTOR 1 was great. It's one of my favorite games, for sure. What I saw from the monsters of Final Fantasy, it often looked like they designed two different creatures that had nothing to do with one another and smashed them together. Hey, that's actually a great way to design a creature. So, I have fearsome, ugly monsters in some of my books, and people ask, how did you come up with this, eyeless beast with, it's like I imagined a triceratops mixed with a bear, and I took its eyes out. Well, that's a scary thing. And I gave it a bigger mouth with poison fangs. It's like, Well, that's very frightening. Yeah, that's the point. It's supposed to be a very, very frightening thing. So that's actually a great way to make a monster. Stephen King would probably describe a monster in ways that would just make you imagine something scary, rather than actually saying, oh, it has big teeth, big, sharp, nasty teeth. He would probably just try to get you to imagine something. And there's also, when it comes to visual storytelling, like with the movie, the less you show of the monster, the more frightening it is. And you can learn that from watching Alien or watching a lot of really classic horror movies. Excuse me. The less you see of the monster, the more effective that monster becomes. Because people's minds fill in the gaps with something that's horrific because of the context. Played Pathfinder for a time, but I self-confessed to being a flake. Then again, I was an immature 17-year-old. We all grow up. Final Fantasy XII had a boss with over 1 million HP. I think that was Tiamat, right? No, or was that Yasmiat? There was like a dragon that that people used to make a character just to kill this dragon because it would take so long to kill this dragon. And it was a dragon that like you could make your character wear dark absorbing gear and it would just be immune to this dragon, and then you could heal it by attacking it with dark attacks. So you just made one character that would just tank it and wreck it. I think people made like a Bushi something else hybrid, Bushi Black Mage hybrid, just to kill it. Which is interesting because it had 1 million HP and it would take an hour to kill it, which is fun. You should try to go on Doug Tindapill's channel or have him come on yours. I don't think I'm significant enough for him to pay attention to me. Codependent. Naughty Dog ruined a lot of games for me after Uncharted and The Last of Us. I've had trouble with the level of expectation. RPGs outside of Bethesda I don't really know as far as PvP goes. I'm loving Apex at the moment. So this is what Cody says. So here's the thing about games right now, is that AAA games are garbage now. They just have gotten that way slowly by replacing classic good game design that people like with microtransactions and garbage meant to suck people's time and take away their money at a greater rate. To the point where I read a story from whoever designed the original Uncharted was told, Uncharted, even though it sold millions of copies, you couldn't put the game out because it's a single player experience. Now, of course, you challenge that with something like last year's God of War that people really liked and a lot of people bought. In fact, I have a copy of it that I haven't ever played it. My wife bought it for me for my birthday last year, and because the TV is not in my office where children aren't allowed, well, my son comes in whenever he feels like it, but where children basically can be restricted, I haven't really been able to play the game because I feel like it's too violent to play around my kids. But eventually I'll get to it. The Final Fantasy games my kids have seen me play or played with me, and those, even though you're like, well, you're killing things, it's like there's no blood in them. It's not quite as intense as something like God of War. But anyway, so when I think about that, how do you know what games are good? There's very little faith in publishers these days. But Square Enix is actually one of the publishers that I think you can count on to produce a pretty decent game at the correct price point. I think Final Fantasy 15 had some DLC. I have Final Fantasy 15, whatever version of it had the DLC, but not a whole lot. And in general, whenever a game is offering DLC, especially on day one, it's probably better to not buy it if you can. I know people get hyped up for games. There's a fear of missing out and things like that. But if you can avoid games that have DLC, because what they tend to do is they're not focusing on having a coherent and good story. They're focusing on selling microtransactions. And usually they sell you a $60 game and they sell you half the story in microtransactions. Or you get something like Mass Effect 2, which is like they sold a bunch of extra little character stories for DLC, and that's not that bad, but again, you're going to feel like you're missing some part of the story because it's chopped up into DLC. They did the same thing with Dragon Age Origins, but all of the little character stories were completely superfluous to the main narrative. But after that game, you started to get a lot more kind of schlocky DLC. I think there was one piece of DLC for the first Mass Effect game. But there's no DLC for Final Fantasy 13. That was a breath of fresh air when I went back and played that, and I'm like, you have the whole game. The whole game is right here, and you can play it. How cool is that? Final Fantasy 12 is great like that too. So yeah, Fallout 76 outside of Bethesda. So Bethesda, yeah, Fallout 76. I didn't buy Fallout 4 because it didn't look good to me. That was the first like Bethesda RPG I just didn't buy. And I'm kind of glad I didn't buy it. I wasn't that keen on Fallout 3 or even Fallout New Vegas. I liked them, but I'm like, I'm not going to pay $60 for Fallout 4. And I still haven't bought Fallout 4 because I look at it and like, even at $15, I'm probably not going to play it, right? I don't love the Fallout setting these days. I don't love what Bethesda did with it. I like Elder Scrolls a lot, but I just don't see a reason to do it. And Fallout 76 looks like Fallout 4, but with no content, right? None of the actual RPG content, nothing that you interact with, just the gameplay elements minus the RPG content. That doesn't sound fun to me. And it would be fun to do Fallout 4 with another person there, maybe, but I don't know. I don't know if it would. I tend to get more introspective when I think about Elder Scrolls and Fallout games. Final Fantasy X is one of my longtime favorite games since childhood and has what felt to be very balanced growth and progression. Yeah, it does. It's okay. I felt like it was very, even though you look at this big board where there's like all these skills, it felt just in general a lot more stripped down in terms of what's available than Final Fantasy IX. And so I kind of felt like it was a simplification. But overall, it's pretty good, and it tells a pretty decent little story in a straightforward way. The characters are a little melodramatic, but part of that has to do with the full voice acting. But overall, talk about which games I like more or less. I don't know if there's really bad Final Fantasy games out there, just ones that I'm not as keen on. Final Fantasy X is probably one that I'm just not as keen on as other Final Fantasy games. Yeah, never touched 76. What's my opinion on Fallout 76? I have not played it and I won't play it. I'm skipping it. If I could play it for free and then make content on it to make money, I guess I would. Or if I had like a strict gaming channel where I knew people wanted my opinion on Fallout 76, I would buy it and play it. But I just looked at it and I was like, I don't see any reason to play it. Everyone was kind of crapping on it for like the bugs and stuff. I just looked at it and I'm like, there's no content. So why would I play a Fallout game without content? Doesn't sound fun to me. The gameplay of Fallout is not the best shooter gameplay ever. So yeah, why play this? And then of course VATS is not going to work. Eatwave says, one of Final Fantasy XIII's biggest missteps was the use of in media res rather than easing players into the conflict and develop the setting. So starting in the middle of things, that's what in media res means. This is a storytelling technique that's very common, and really it's from epic poetry. It goes back to like Homer. You start in the middle of things and then you backfill what you need. And in fact, if you're writing a book, I probably recommend in most cases you do that. That's what most contemporary fiction tends to do. Like Star Wars actually starts in the middle of things. It doesn't start at the beginning. It starts on episode 4 and then it begins with like a ship being chased and you kind of fill in the gaps as to what happened. Now, I don't think it was a mistake. Now, it was a misstep. It could have been a misstep, but the mistake was they did not find a way to explain the back part of it efficiently. So if you weren't going to explain, if you're going to start in the middle of things and not explain, they kept having these flashback scenes, but none of them explained what the hell was going on. It was just like characters interacting. And the character interactions just were mostly melodrama. And when I say melodrama, I mean they didn't feel authentic. They didn't feel like revelatory for the characters. It just felt like they were emoting at each other. And most of the characters didn't seem to have a real reason to emote, to have the emotions they had. So I think, yes, I would agree it's a misstep in the way that they actually executed the story, but it wouldn't have been a misstep if they did things better. Then it would have been fine, because it was actually really cool. The opening scenes of Final Fantasy XIII really sucked me in. I'm like, what the hell is going on? That's a good thing. You want the viewer, or the player, or the reader, whatever. You want them to really go, I want to know more. That's when you give them more, and you start to sprinkle that in. Like they should have really spent those first chapters explaining how the world worked in a better fashion. Now, there's a couple things they could have done to fix that, and one of them is if they had actually had somebody who had no idea how any of that worked, then that facilitates a lot more info dumps. Recently with Alita Battle Angel, Alita doesn't know anything, and so they get to do these little mini info dumps for her. This is how the world works. This place is called Iron City, not the junkyard, but Iron City, or the scrapyard. And this works like this, and this is a sport that's like this. So they got to do all these info dumps because she has no memory. She doesn't know what's going on. They really needed a character like that in Final Fantasy 13 because the world was so complex that you can't understand the plot because you can't understand the stakes unless you understand the world. So the plot ended up feeling like this convoluted mess because you just didn't know what the hell was going on until way deep in the game, like the end of chapter 10. That's like 40 hours into the game or something, 50 hours. It's way into the game, way too far into the game for the audience to finally figure out how things are actually supposed to work. And then after that, you go down to like Grand Pulse and then just wander around for a while. Actually, I thought the worst part of Final Fantasy 13 is Chapter 11 because you were on the rails and you were in a narrative until Chapter 11 where they're like, go explore, right? Lots of people are like, oh, Chapter 11, you finally get to explore and you're not like on some kind of linear adventure. It's like that's when the game broke down for me because the linear story is what Final Fantasy is about. So as soon as they got off the rails with that, Chapter 11, I actually was like, let me just look up a guide and it's like, do these missions in this order. I'm like, okay, now I can be done with Chapter 11 and it's garbage and get back into the story, and finish this game off. And I almost never use a guide for games because that's not part of the fun. But I just wanted to be free of wandering around getting owned by giant dog monsters with like saw blades. I just didn't want to do that. I wanted to get back to Final Fantasy 13. Can you tell me how death works on Final Fantasy X? So, the idea of death in Final Fantasy X is that your spirit does not depart to the afterlife unless a priest sends it there. That's the setup for death. And so, if a character can manage to be undead, like some of the characters like Seymour end up undead, that means that they have essentially died but have found a way to avoid having their spirit sent, so their spirit lives on looking like an animated human. It's a really weird thing to think about. Like, why would people want to be sent to the afterlife? Well, believe it or not, I think most people would after a life of suffering prefer to move on rather than hang around in a fallen world. But a lot of people are afraid of death and therefore don't think in the terms of that. If you have a sure afterlife, you'd probably be okay leaving the fallen world behind. So that's an interesting thing in Final Fantasy X. They have these reveals. It's like, haha, I'm actually dead. And it's like, well, how do we get rid of you? It's like, well, we have to defeat him and then send his spirit on its way. From Grim Angel X4, I once read an interview that Wada and Kitase had no idea what they were doing with Final Fantasy 13 due to the development hell. All they knew is they had to finish it and they had to reach the ending. Yeah, I've heard that as well. And it kind of comes across like the gameplay is actually really cool. The aesthetics are the best in the series. The world building's very interesting. It's clear that they spent some time trying to think about how the world works. The problem is trying to string all that together in a series of scenes. And they weren't able to talk their way through the connection well enough for the story to be sold. And I think once you get the sequels, you probably have a little bit better understanding of what the heck was going on. And yeah, development hell, if you guys don't know what development hell is, that's where just a game doesn't seem to be able to come out. It just gets stuck in development. Things don't seem to progress. Usually what happens is that you end up, if you're understaffed, things take way longer to do. Or you get into sunk cost things where you think of a feature and you spend a bunch of time on it and you refuse to let that feature go. There's a lot of things that create development hell. The most famous one is probably Duke Nukem Forever, which had like a 20-year development where they scrapped the game over and over again to try to make it better because it just wasn't living up to their standards and it just never came out. There's screenshots from like a Duke Nukem Forever from like 2000. Never came out. 2005 never came out. Finally it came out in like 2011 after the studio got shut down. I remember when the studio got shut down because one of the guys who worked at 3D Realms maintains the Black Sabbath band site, blacksabbath.com, and it was like, so I read it on there, and so I had talked with him. It's like, oh wow. But the whole time they were really trying to make the game, and when they finally got shut down, the game came out, and it's like they didn't get credit for it. I purchased KOTOR 2 in 2010, so would never have known about the additional storyline. Yeah, so the original KOTOR 2, like, it was hated when it came out. It's the same reason many people hate the story of Metal Gear Solid 5. They had a separate version that came with an unfinished cutscenes for its third act. Yeah. Final Fantasy 12 counts as art in that regard. Final Fantasy 13 counts as art. Yeah, it's awesome. It's artistically, it's great, and the gameplay is actually really good, and the animations are on point. In fact, it was, even though took so long to develop, it was way ahead of anything else in that generation. The Xbox 360, PlayStation 3 generation just looked way better than anything else that came out on that system. And I don't know how they did it, but clever use of things. But even when you look at the environments, and I recommend everybody play Final Fantasy 13 if you're into games or you just want to look at something pretty. It's not a hard game for the most part. It has as much challenge as you really want to choose to have, and you can just look up guides for how to like cheese most bosses if you're not about like doing challenging content. You go and you look around an area, and you're like, someone spent a ridiculous amount of time making this level of detail and making it look like this. Like, it is almost over designed. It is really good looking game in terms of the environments, the character animations, even the character design. The character design is there. It's made to look, so every character has some sort of different, almost anime-like look where things are very exaggerated. And I didn't like that as much, but it was okay in context. I probably would have wanted less extreme character designs in Final Fantasy 13. In Final Fantasy 12, the character designs were less extreme, and the arms and armor felt more practical and appropriate than Final Fantasy 13, where it's like, yeah, I'm this knight that uses a gunblade and has one shoulder pad and half a cape, and I wear this like mini skirt, and I have a very obnoxious thigh gap that probably wouldn't be possible, and pink hair, the whole bit. Like the character designs, they look good, but they're extreme, like they're caricatures, and it feels a little weird in context, but it works. I think it still works. That's I missed some stuff. Whoa, so many chats that I missed. So going into development hell, I'll just jump to the bottom again. Shinyogo says, there was another notorious one called Too Human that kept getting scrapped and scrapped. From a PS1 cyberpunk RPG to a GameCube title to a techno-Norse game for Xbox 360 that bombed. Yes, I actually remember something like that. It just kept getting remade, and so each time the development team would get reformed, they would just make another game and reuse like 2% of the assets. The truth is that you can't reuse assets very well. It's really hard to reuse assets unless you're just making like the same game again, or making an expansion. It's really hard to reuse assets because there's, the engine gets updated. If you switch engines, transferring assets between engines becomes not only impossible in some cases, it becomes pointless. If you were making something in the Unreal 3 engine and then you're like, well, let's put it in Frostbite. You may not be able to put those assets in, but also the assets won't look correct with Frostbite's engine. Like, you design the assets to use the graphics engine that's there. So, the lighting, the way the lighting works in Frostbite engines can maybe be different, or there's more detail in the newer upgraded, engine, and so you want to redesign the assets so they take full advantage of that fidelity. But yeah, there's so many interesting stories about that. I remember Final Fantasy 13 had a big engine issue that forced SE to render the environments mostly as linear corridors. Otherwise, it would cause the game to crash. That's interesting. I hadn't heard that. Final Fantasy 12, in my opinion, the best Gilgamesh fight in the series. I'm no expert, though. Yeah, you ever played Vagrant Story? I haven't played it, actually. Maybe I can go back. There's a whole bunch of great RPGs to be played on the original PlayStation, the Sega Saturn, and actually the Genesis that a lot of people overlook. And some of them you can get with, like Shining Force, you can get them in the Genesis Classics. Other ones are harder to find. Same thing with Super Nintendo. Like I remember one called Arcana that I really enjoyed, where it was like you played like cards instead of everything was represented as a card. I don't know why they did that, but it had these like the 3D dungeon crawler things. It was one of those, but a JRPG. It was really fun. All right, let me go back up to some of the other chats that I missed. Speaking of KOTOR 2, did anyone ever finish the restoration? I didn't. I need to go back and play KOTOR 2. I'll probably do that, and I might stream it because it'll be my first time playing it. Final Fantasy X is an example of what 13 tried to achieve system-wise, I guess. Remember not having to grind at all in that game as long as I understood the monster's weaknesses and avoided fleeing. Yeah, Final Fantasy X was great because I never had to feel like I had to stop and grind up experience. Final Fantasy 13 almost did that except for Chapter 11. It was pretty good. Jorge says, to be honest, I hate Andromeda. I still can't get through Final Fantasy 13 because of the story. Yeah. I'll stick with Mass Effect 1 through 3 and Red Dead until I find a game that won't make me homicidal. Yeah, try Final Fantasy 12. The remaster of it is really good and the gameplay's awesome. If you liked Dragon Age Origins, it's like a precursor to what Origins did, only without like the positional tactics as much. But you do have the ability to essentially program your party to do certain actions with certain triggers. And so when you kind of do that, then it becomes this sort of fluid thing where you can run through and kill things, and it becomes a lot more fun to engage in that gameplay. I kind of miss it, and I wish they'd make another game like Final Fantasy 12 as far as the gameplay goes. But Final Fantasy 13 had very interesting gameplay as well, and I did actually enjoy it. You need a Gambit so you could leave it half a day playing automatically. You just run through the corridors and watch it do automatic things. And with the remake, you can tap the L1 button on your PlayStation controller, and it speeds it up so you can just run across town real quick. So it's like, oh man, this is what these games need, is a fast forward button so I can run super fast and not have to sit there and slowly run past the NPCs. Grimelda says, just watched a review of TFA. If your review was a movie scene, it would be Sarah Connor being burned alive on Judgment Day. I wish I'd found sooner. I agree wholly with your review. Okay, well, I didn't know if that was a compliment or not, but thanks. I liked that scene, though, where she turned into a skeleton. That gave me nightmares as a kid. Any thoughts on Final Fantasy X's combat compared to the active time battle of the SNES and PS1 titles? I prefer Final Fantasy X's combat to the active time battle. I'm not a big fan of active time battle of those PlayStation ones. It's okay, but I'm not a big fan of it. I like the whole point of turn-based is for me to sit and think about it a little bit, right? So I'm not a huge fan of the ATB system. It's okay, I don't hate it, but I think I just like strict turns better. And what I liked best was, I like turns. I think Final Fantasy 9 did this to an extent, even though ATB's there. It's like your turn is determined by like your speed and things like that. And a JRPG that was for the Game Boy Advance called Golden Sun, a couple of them, where, if you hyped up your player's agility, they could attack like 2 times before the monster could, and you could really control the order of what was going to go on there if you knew how to interact with the systems. Bruno Corden says, I find it interesting how they adapt creatures from all kinds of mythology and fit it into their own lore, like Odin. Yeah, they start with that and then they kind of adapt it, and that's interesting as well. So that's something that I think starts with like the very first Final Fantasy game. As they go on, certain things become characteristic of the series, and you have to kind of adapt them to the new lore, because each game tends to have its own lore, with some small exceptions. I think Final Fantasy IV takes place on Ivalice or Ivalice, and so does Final Fantasy XII. So does Tactics Advance and Advance 2 and Final Fantasy Tactics, but they're different versions of Ivalice. Yeah, Final Fantasy Tactics is in it, but it's just a very different version. In fact, Final Fantasy Tactics is probably my favorite Final Fantasy game, even though it's not a main series game. It just had great gameplay and a cool story. I really enjoyed Final Fantasy Tactics for the PlayStation. You can get it for the Android and iOS now too, and I actually recommend that port. It's pretty good. It's better than the PSP port, which is what I have played last, so it's good. Opinion on Anthem. I haven't played it. I've barely watched a couple of game reviewers play it. It wasn't on my radar. Nothing that Bioware comes out with is on my radar anymore. I don't consider them a good company anymore, and I don't count on them to make any good games at this point in time. And that really starts with, where does that start with? I mean, you can see the downfall, but basically by the time by the time you get to like Mass Effect 3, you can see the writing on the wall as far as it's going downhill. Dragon Age Inquisition is when I knew I probably would never buy another BioWare game. Like, BioWare used to be a company I would buy any game from BioWare at full price because I knew it was going to be good, and I don't feel that way anymore. Not only do I not feel like I want to pay full price for a BioWare game, I probably wouldn't buy it on sale or waste any time with a BioWare game unless I had it on really good authority that it was going to be good. So like if a lot of people that have the same taste as me, they like it, then BioWare can get back good in my book. I didn't play Andromeda, no reason to. Dragon Age Inquisition, I never finished it because I so intensely disliked it. I thought it was a beautiful piece of garbage, as far as I'm concerned. And I knew that they had lost their way as far as trying to design good games, and were at that point trying to design. They were just it was another EA product. There is no more BioWare, guys. It's BioWare subsidiary of EA. And when you understand that, then it's not hard to like mourn the loss of BioWare. Everybody that was good in the studio's gone off to do other things, BioWare once said that Anthem was going to be the Bob Dylan of games. They even codenamed it Bob. What does that mean, though? Because some people hate Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan's not a good singer. So you're talking, the content's good, but the execution's terrible. That's what I think when I think of Bob Dylan. And I don't dislike Bob Dylan's music, but I think it's usually better if somebody covers Bob Dylan. Somebody who's good at better at the execution part and can sing his lyrics and his music. And Bob Dylan, of course, what's even better is just go back and listen to the things that influenced Bob Dylan, like Clancy Brothers, right? Go listen to Liam Clancy. And after the stream is done, go listen to some Liam Clancy. It's good, okay? And he's a great singer. Why do people keep saying single-player games are dead? And it seems like single-player games are the AAA games doing better financially than most multiplayers now. So I'll tell you why they say single-player games are dead. And that's because studios are always trying to maximize the efficiency of labor to return. Because the labor is going to be the most expensive part, generally. Right? It's just a cost to return thing. So if you make a game like FIFA, where you can sell people loot boxes all day long, the initial investment is the same as a single player game, but the return is so much larger. So what the pressure tends to be, well, every game needs to perform like FIFA. So EA shut down the studio that made Dead Space, which is, I don't remember the name of the studio right now, but you guys will know what I'm talking about. So they shut it down, even though Dead Space was really good and made money. But they shut it down because it wasn't making as much money as FIFA. And I think they brought in, I don't remember the dev's name. They brought her in and they're like, "Where's your FIFA?" And she's like, "That's not what Dead Space is." And it was like, then fairly well. Everything needs to be as highly profitable as possible. Now, there's some mistakes with that, right? Which is that everyone who buys the single player only experience, AAA experience, that they're going to buy a game which monetizes them the same way that FIFA does. that that's the same players and that's what they are willing to accept. You cannot make a JRPG with a large amount of downloadable content. You can make one, and have DLC, but the DLC needs to be superfluous to the story, or it won't make sense, or it'll end up making the game really bad. So I think when people say AAA, the single player games are dead, it's the companies that want them to be dead because they can make more money off a smaller investment. Think of like Call of Duty, right? It's the same game. They just come out with the same game every year, charge people $50 for it, plus another 20 to 40 to $50 for maps, and force them into this microtransaction cycle where they're playing the same game year after year. That's what they want, right? Because it's less effort to return versus making, Dead Space 1, Dead Space 2, Dead Space 3, right? Making each game. That's a lot of effort. And in fact, probably the only company that's left that will still make good games is Rockstar. Because I don't know why, but maybe it's because I don't know if they're publicly traded or not. But essentially, as soon as a company becomes publicly traded or becomes owned by a publicly traded company, the directive that comes from the stockholders and therefore the board of directors is the maximum amount of profit no matter what, always. That's why you can have the most revenue you've ever collected and then lay people off, because it's about shrinking down your costs and maximizing your returns, and not about making good quality art. It is not about that. Now, with movies, it's kind of interesting. A $200 million movie, it's like you have to spend that $200 million to make it good enough that people see it because of the way movies are. But with games, there's a whole bunch of different ways to separate people from their money, and that's why they want that out. There's a fear of missing out in Oblivion with Horse Armor. The Horse Armor DLC came with whatever edition of Oblivion I bought back in the day. And so I put it on a horse. I'm like, well, this was stupid. People paid $5 for this. But it began. That's where it began with, Lobster 11 says, with Fallout 76, Anthem, Battlefield 5, AAA games are just bad nowadays. Yeah. Hopefully Cyberpunk will be different. Hopefully, yeah. I mean, I hope any game will be different. But I don't trust any company I don't trust any non-Japanese company to deliver a game that's good. The Japanese have a different set of ethics and things that drive them. So I know a Square Enix game, even a bad Square Enix RPG, is probably going to be good enough for me to buy. Even ones that people really didn't like Last Remnant, I really enjoyed. Final Fantasy 15 has tons of DLC, but it's pretty cheap and there are good deals on bundles. I think I have the edition that has all of them. I didn't buy it when it was new. Final Fantasy 15 was originally going to be a Final Fantasy 13 sequel. It was going to be called Final Fantasy Versus 13, and they kind of spun it into a new rendition of that original thing and system that they had. God of War is very good. They merged because it's like, oh man, that's that random reinforcement. It's like we can really monetize that. And that's when kind of the straw broke, or the straw that broke the camel's back, where people started to go, wait, selling gambling items in a otherwise competitive game is really messed up. Yeah, DLC is not bad in and of itself. This is what Vision Storm says. It truly enhances the experience from a baseline complete game, like new storyline, but it's become basically a way to lock features behind paywalls. Yeah, that's I feel that way too. Or you sell power, right? This is something Bioware started doing years ago, even with Dragon Age Origins. They sell power. Hey, you buy this DLC, you get this gun that's more powerful than the standard gun. And I'm like, in a single player game where you can adjust the difficulty of the game, buying power is stupid. You do not need to buy any special item. That is completely dumb. If the game is too hard, you can just turn down the difficulty. If they tune the game to be too hard to where you have to use these DLC items, just turn down the difficulty. Nobody cares that you played it on normal instead of nightmare, I used to pride myself on always playing on the hardest mode, and I think with Mass Effect 3, I'm like, I don't like having to repeat these unbalanced, poorly designed encounters because of the difficulty I chose. So I'm just going to play it on normal and face roll through it. And that's kind of what I ended up doing. What do you think is the best part of Final Fantasy VII? I don't know. It's hard to say. I really don't know. I like the setting. I think Final Fantasy VII is not as good as... it's not my favorite Final Fantasy game, and it's not quite as good as people remember it, I think. But I'll be interested in what the remake does. Fallout 4 was better than New Vegas, says Cody. Next comment from Jefferson Johnson. Fallout 4 was boring. I saw the dialogue wheel in Fallout 4 and it made me not buy the game. As soon as I see a dialogue wheel now, I'm like, I'm out. I don't want to play it. Dialogue wheels are stupid. And I'll tell you why. If you play Dragon Age Origins or KOTOR or any of the old Bioware games where there was no dialogue wheel, the dialogue wheel is like an explanation for autistic people. No offense if you're watching this and you're on the spectrum. It's like an explanation for autistic people as to what the intent behind it is. So one of the most annoying things in Dragon Age 2 was that... Now, the dialogue wheel in Mass Effect, I didn't mind that much because it's kind of... Shepard is Shepard. Shepard is not you or your character that you design. Shepard is Shepard, right? So it's bothers me less in Mass Effect. But anyway... In Dragon Age 2, you'd scroll over it and there'd be like a word that summarized what he was going to say, and it would have a heart show. And you'd just be like, so I guess I clicked the heart button to see if this character likes me or to make them like me. You don't have to think about what the character thinks. If you go to Dragon Age Origins, it's 4 things. They're not voiced over. It's silent protagonist, which I like. Because you can imagine your own voice or the voice of whoever you design. I often play as female characters, by the way. Just a fun little fact, because it's just it usually is a little bit different story experience. If you have an option of a male or a female, I tend to pick female as often as male, if not a little bit more, because I think it just ends up being a little bit more interesting. Because I'm not a female, so I kind of like to maybe experience the story rather than as me as some other character I imagine. Anyway, so you'll see 4 things, like you're talking to Morgan. There's 4 things that you can say. You have to think, knowing Morgan, what thing she wants you to say, and click that thing. And if you don't click the thing that she would like you to say, you lose reputation with her. You lose your relationship with her. You upset her. If you get to a certain point where she likes you, she'll stop wanting to sleep with you because she likes you. It's weird, And so those are all quirks that can't exist in a dialogue wheel. The dialogue wheel takes any of the thought of role-playing out of it. It reduces the game down to click the heart, click the scary one, click the red one for Renegade, click the blue one for Paragon. It becomes a really boring RPG experience. So as soon as I saw that in Fallout 4, I'm like, I'm not going to buy it. Rusty Heckler says, laters. Mike, thoughts on The Witcher? I like the first Witcher a lot. I like the second Witcher a lot. I have Witcher 3. I haven't ever played it because people are like, it's a 100-hour game. I'm like, I don't have 100 hours to play. So I'll probably try Witcher 3 at some point here and avoid as many side quests as possible and see if I like it. There's a lot of side quests in Witcher games, and I'm not crazy about them at this point. Too many side quests, that's a thing that starts to wear on me with some of these RPGs. 100 hours worth of good content is very different from 100 hours worth of side quests. And that's kind of why Mass Effect 2 is one of my less favorite games as far as like Mass Effect goes. It was like one long side quest. Like a bunch of side quests and then finally the ending happens. I didn't like that. I liked Mass Effect 1's plot a lot better. I loved Mass Effect 1's plot. Let's keep going. So while most JRPGs are very story-driven, what about Zelda Breath of the Wild? This is from Astral Knights. It's not a JRPG. So Zelda's an action game. It's never been a JRPG, even though it's made by a Japanese company. It has RPG elements. I don't consider Zelda to be a JRPG. It's an adventure game. Breath of the Wild has very little story, and that's one of my complaints about it. It's not just that it has very little story. It's that the world is big and expansive and beautiful, and you can explore and go anywhere. But you don't know, there's no meaning attached to any of the places that you go, unlike Elder Scrolls, where you could read a book and figure out who lived there, or there's NPCs to interact with. There's a couple towns, you find a temple. What is this temple? What does it mean? What about it? Why am I here? So there was a detached meaning to the game. So it felt like the world was set up, but it wasn't fully fleshed out. And that's my complaint about it. What do you think about how Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest have evolved differently over the years? Great question from Clockwork Mummy. I love how they've done their different things. So Final Fantasy has decided it's going to do something new each time. It's going to change system. It's going to be experimental, but it's still going to be like the highest quality. It's the flagship of Square Enix. So whenever you look at a Final Fantasy game, you're looking at, the best the company can produce, as well as trying new things and trying to deliver new experiences to people. And there's always a little bit of classic feeling to it, but it's new each time. Whereas Dragon Quest is about delivering the classic experience in the best way possible, delivering on classic expectations. So Dragon Quest XI, it's a great game. I really like it, and it's very old school. It's turn-based, strictly. The camera, there's several different camera modes you can use. You can kind of decide how you want to aesthetically experience the game, but it's beautiful to look at aesthetically, even with the weird anime faces that at first were a little off-putting. It still is a pretty cool looking game. But the classic gameplay's there. So if you like classic JRPG gameplay that's story-driven and full of exploration while you're doing that story, then Dragon Quest is great. So they went in different directions. One's experimental, one is variations on the theme, and that's great. That way, nobody who picks up a Final Fantasy game is going to be upset that they abandoned the systems of the previous Final Fantasy game at this point, because they've done, each 10, 12, we'll skip the MMOs, 10, 12, 13, 15. Very, very different combat systems. So at this point, no one expects the same thing that they're used to. But if you were to try to do too much different with Dragon Quest, people would be like, well, I really wanted a Dragon Quest game. So it's great that they're separate. It's perfect. And if you don't like the classic, you know what you're getting with the Dragon Quest game. If you don't like it, skip it. It's great. It's a great ability to present some consumer choice there. As long as you've established that kind of experimentation, it's fine to do. Elder Scrolls carries with it a bunch of expectations about exactly how it's going to work. Like, the combat system might be different. We get that you're going to change some things, but we're still expecting certain things to be there. And so whenever something is removed from an Elder Scrolls game, people get upset about it. Yeah. Kefka and Sephiroth are both great villains. Kefka is a monster driven by his own nihilism and warped by his own science. Sephiroth is a tragic hero gone mad who ends up manipulating cells. Yeah, I like them both. Final Fantasy tends to have really cool villains. I've noticed that. I actually, even Golbez, right? Like, Golbez is this villain that turns out to not really be a villain. They just didn't understand what was going on. Seymour is effective. Seymour's effective. Dirty Guado. I thought it was hilarious that they called them Guados, because Guado has a meaning in the United States. So, like, Guado is kind of like a racial slur here for like a, like an Italian American man. Kind of like Guido. So Guado, you hear Guado as like Guido, kind of means the same thing, right? So that's something that people used to call people here, like Guados. Might just be a Central California thing. Do you think the live stream still would have helped Holly in destroying? Livestream still would have helped Holly in destroying Meteor if Aerith didn't. Insert spoiler here. I don't know. I don't know if I remember what you're talking about. Sorry. Too abstracted. Keep in mind, like, some Final Fantasy games I haven't played in like 20 years, so I don't remember them. I have the Final Fantasy 9 port on my phone, and it's great. And if you buy it for Switch, you're going to buy the Android port. It's a really good port. For some reason, all the publications are like crapping on it. It's a great port, guys. It's fine. If you don't like the port, go play it on a PlayStation 1. Go get your PlayStation 1 out, dust it off, or go get a copy. Or play a ROM of it on your computer. Do whatever you want to play the original. Or buy the PSP port on your Vita, or whatever it's going to be. There's different versions. The port is a good port. I think their big complaint was like, each time you go back to the map after a battle, the music starts over again. I'm like, I didn't notice that. I barely noticed like the overworld music, The music's great. It's a good port, guys. The only thing that might be weird about it, actually, it'll probably be great on Switch, because if you're playing mobile, they made the words big, because it looks good on a mobile display. If you're playing on a big TV, you'd be like, those words are big. But if you're doing handheld, it probably looks really good. So yeah, I do like the Final Fantasy IX port. It's good. The characters are all in a little bit higher fidelity, and the backgrounds are in a higher fidelity. You miss a little bit of that impressionistic feel you got from the blurry PS1, but it's okay. It looks great. And in fact, I love the painted backgrounds of Final Fantasy IX. They're beautiful. It's aesthetically a really cool game to look at. The art, I would love to see the art in even higher fidelity, like redrawn or something. But it looks great. It's a great looking game. Another game I played lately, Bravely Default on 3DS. And that's kind of an older one, but that's a Square Enix RPG. Pretty fun little one, with these weird little chibis that fight each other. But yeah, classic experience again. Classic experience like Dragon Quest, with some extra things. AAA with single player and quality stories, also Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Yeah, but that's also offered a little bit cheaper too. It's kind of like AAA but cheaper. That's a good one. I always saw Seymour, this is what Bruno says, as a more annoying Team Rocket character. Yes. And the actual villain he's not the real. I mean, Sin is like the big bad guy, which turns out, I don't want to give spoilers. No spoilers for who that is. I saw it coming, but like, yeah, he's kind of like a Team Rocket character. The big villainous force was actually the Yu Yevon in Sin. It's a tragic hero made a mindless monster. Yeah, I don't want to explain who Sin is and who Yu Yevon, how all that works out, but it's a great ending. Actually, Final Fantasy X, that things come to a great ending. I think Seymour was inserted in there because they needed more obstacles. Like, there needs to be a lot of obstacles before you get to the end, and that was part of it. Best part about Duke Nukem. Whoops, chat jumped down. Sorry. Wow, I missed a lot of chat. I'm very sorry. Let me jump to the bottom, and then I'll jump up to the top again. Does anyone remember the Army Man franchise? On PlayStation, I remember it. Never played it. Yeah, the pre-rendered backgrounds are true beauties from the past, says Bruno. Bravely Default is a sparkling homage to them. That's what I really liked about Bravely Default. It's like it's beautiful looking. And great gameplay. Fully voiced over in a way that like that really like reinforces the characters' personalities. Little melodramatic, but I kind of expect that with JRPGs. It works great, I really do like it. Seymour and Yuna are still technically married. They never got a divorce. Au contraire, Zach Boyd, because you can't marry a dead man. So they were never married legally. It was according to the Catholic Church, they were never married because you can't marry a dead man. So there you go. You're good. And I'm sure the Church of Yu Yevon is the same. Church of Yevon. Let's see here. Hop back up here. Final Fantasy IV sequel that was only available on the Wii Shop channel. I think it was called the After Years. I had a friend who played it. I never played it. If it's available for PSP, I might play it. You could probably get it on the PS Vita shop. Play it on the Vita, which they're like phasing out the Vita. It's so sad because it was such an underrated little system. So many cool features, such a great display, great feel to it. I'm going to miss the Vita. I still use it. I can still use it to play my PS4 though. That's great. Let's jump up a little higher here. What Grimalda says about Sarah Connor being burned alive. It's like the explanation of a movie scene. It felt like I was watching a fan of Star Wars being burned alive. I know it's melodramatic, but it's what pops into my mind. I felt the same way, yeah. Well, these newer Star Wars movies, you thought Force Awakens is bad. I went back and rethought about it after seeing Last Jedi. I was like, I thought Force Awakens was a bad movie, but I think it had a genuine attempt by a fan to be good. And so I can see it from that angle. Whereas Last Jedi, it felt like they actively hated Star Wars. Like I didn't feel like JJ hated Star Wars when I was watching Force Awakens. I just felt like he had bad ideas for it. But I actually felt like Rian Johnson dislikes Star Wars and dislikes the fans and wanted them to be bad. Golden Sun producer worked for Sega and a lot of RPGs like Shining in the Darkness, Shining Fortress, etc. Good. Yeah, it's a great game. Bioware went to crap? Yes. If I throw a rock at your head, will you forget the bad battle mechanics from War in the North? Question, have you read The Children of Húrin? I did read The Children of Húrin. I think it's a good story, and I like the prose quite a bit, so it's good. I like it. So, worthy of the canon, in my opinion. Final Fantasy took a lot of inspiration from Star Wars with their characters or aesthetics from Bruno. Yeah, of course, like Star Wars is very iconic. Even if you look at a Borg cube, you're looking at the Death Star, right? So there's lots of influence that goes back and forth. My thing is MMOs. I never have buddies to play with. That's Jefferson Johnson. I play WoW, Lord of the Rings Online, Final Fantasy 14. I really feel the same way. I feel like I'm too old to make new friends. Like I made all these amazing friends in Classic and Burning Crusade, even friends that we've been at each other's weddings and stuff, and met playing WoW. I just don't see that happening. Even EverQuest, it's not there anymore. I don't know what can bring it back. I just don't know. Or maybe I'm too old for it. It's so hard. And everybody that I played with, like we all grew up, kids, jobs that are more intensive. Nobody wants to spend time in like a virtual world like they used to. Oh well. From Jared. They make another Star Wars RPG. What do you think they should take note from Final Fantasy in regards to the storytelling in light of how people view the current Star Wars games? Well, I mean, I would really look at KOTOR and KOTOR 2 probably as the mold. They had really great stories. And the stories were very Star Wars. If they were going to take a cue from Final Fantasy, the cue from Final Fantasy to me is just having, if you want to have, how should I put this? If you want to have that feeling of a hero's journey, an RPG really produces it as you grow and you learn skills. And KOTOR and KOTOR 2 both did that really well, but KOTOR 1 kind of leaned on this memory mind wipe thing, and it was a great plot device. They leaned on that to produce, this unexpected event of him being a Jedi. But I think you could learn from Final Fantasy as far as well, first of all, you could learn from it in the way that they approach aesthetics and systems, as far as just having really great aesthetics all the time. I haven't played a Star Wars game in a long time that I felt like had aesthetics that matched Star Wars. Oddly, I'd rather go back and play KOTOR with its low fidelity graphics than play most of the newer Star Wars games, because I just don't think I just feel like they're missing the boat. Even Tor Online, to a certain extent, I felt like it really missed the aesthetics boat. So I think just really getting great Baroque aesthetics would be a good one. Other than that, I don't know, because I don't know if you want a Star Wars game to be JRPG, like super narrative focused or not. I think most people would expect something more like KOTOR, which is very narrative focused, but you feel like the player's agency, the development of the character, and the player agency involved in that is its own thing. Oh, I'm sorry. I guess the stream froze for a minute. I really apologize for that. I don't know what happened there. So on my side, it looked like it was fine, but there's probably some network issues happening tonight that I don't really have control over because of when I stream. So hopefully you guys can see me now. And I apologize if there was a freeze in it and it wasn't working correctly. Again, I'm always a little bit behind. I'm always a little bit behind on it. Okay, stream's fine. Okay, good. Sorry for the interrupt. I'm not always on top of that because it doesn't always show up on my little interface here that there's an interrupt, a network interrupt. Let's go down a little further here. One of my favorite games to watch someone else play, but not necessarily play myself, was Homeworld. Yeah, interesting. I don't know if I have a good response to that. Bloodrock says, you say you played a lot of Bioware games. Is the Sonic Chronicles fiasco before or after you thought they were a compromised studio? Did you play it? I never played Sonic Chronicles. I didn't know Bioware did that, actually. So I guess that wasn't part of my thought process. I'm sorry if I missed a really bad, like a stinker from the past. I don't remember Sonic Chronicles, and I wasn't aware that Bioware did it. So I guess that just wasn't on my radar. I apologize. I'm making like general statements about a company, and I haven't actually played their Sonic the Hedgehog stuff. I haven't played the last Sonic game I played was Sonic Mania, and the last Sonic game I played before that was like Sonic Spinball or Sonic, whatever the last Genesis game was. I had zero interest in 3D Sonic games. I never liked the gameplay of them at all. So I'm just not going to play them. I'm enjoying the story in Divinity. Yeah, Divinity's cool. I'll have to play it again. I haven't really gotten deep into the Divinity Original Sin stuff, but whatever. Fallout fares like Skyrim. If you like Skyrim, then you might like it too. I don't like the setting of Fallout very much. Post-apocalyptic is just not very interesting for me. It's just how it is. It's Fallen World stuff. It's fine, but I just don't like the setting of Fallout very much. Usually I enjoy the games for what they are, play them once, and then I'm done with them. Okay. I asked this before, but I don't know if you missed it or I lost track. Do you think Oh, yeah. I don't know how to answer it. Unicorn on the Cob says Ryan Johnson hates anything objective. His goal is to piss people off by being artistic, which simply means he likes to deconstruct things till they no longer resemble their former selves. Right? If you put a poo-poo on a plate and people get upset, and it's like, it's art. It's like, you can only do that so many times before people are like, well, that's stupid. I paid money to enjoy something. Jack Quill says, I have a PC and have never played Final Fantasy. Any good intro games? There are so many. Final Fantasy IV is a great one to start with, and you can play that on a Famicom emulator, and it's really good. It'll give you a feel. Final Fantasy VI is also very good. I have a lot of affection for that one. Final Fantasy VII, obviously, you can set up an emulator to play it or play the remake. That's a good one. Those are more classic ones. Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3 you can play, but they're not as good as 4 on. They just, it was early, so they're just not as cool. Final Fantasy 4 is the first one that had a really good story, a really cool story where everything worked for that story, and you really cared about the characters. And part of it's that I have a lot of nostalgia for it, having played it as a kid, but I still think it holds up. Yeah. Final Fantasy IV Complete Edition for the PSP or on the PSN for the Vita. Yeah, that's a cool one. Includes all the stuff. Don't know how Star Wars cannot have good lightsaber duels gameplay. I don't know. I don't know how they never managed that. Maybe because it's too much. I know for sure you're a professor for how long you take on questions. I prefer to answer thoroughly if I can. Sonic Chronicles came out in 2008. I believe it was before Bioware was absorbed by EA. Could be wrong. I never played it. If it was bad, I'm sorry I don't know about it. I didn't realize that Bioware had anything to do with it. After Divinity 1 and 2, I gave Tyranny a try, and I'm really enjoying it. Okay, cool. The idea of playing as a general to an evil overlord is a breath of fresh air in a CRPG. Yeah, I kind of like the idea of playing as a bad guy. That's one of the things that was really appealing about KOTOR is like you had the option of being bad, and each choice you made, it's like I could do some dark side stuff here. I'm gonna make this guy give me his credits. And when your party members object, you're just like, dude, we need credits. Of course, we use your Jedi mind trick to like, no, you will waive the landing fee. And then Bastila is like, you can't just use your force powers for bad. And it's like, yeah, I can. And you still like me. In fact, I'm going to turn you, you're going to be the dark side girl at the end. You know, it's all good. So I really like the feeling of being able to choose good or bad. In Mass Effect, you had, you know, Renegade Paragon, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same as being a Sith. It's really cool to choose which way you're going to go. That's actually one of the problems I had with the tour online. I played it in the beta and decided not to play it live. I played the beta quite a bit, actually. It wasn't a good MMO, and the idea of like just picking Sith, and they're like, your decisions matter. I'm like, it's not going to feel like an Old Republic game if you just pick what side. Ultimately, none of your decisions really mattered anyway. And you were very aware of like the illusion of choice. I remember seeing The Last Jedi in theater. When Luke threw the lightsaber behind his shoulder, someone in the audience yelled, "What the hell, man?" I remember the moment that I knew it was like bad, it was going to be bad, is when Poe crank called General Hux. And it was like very clearly intended to be funny, and everyone was just silent. And you could almost hear like someone cough. It was just like dead silent. And you could feel there was an energy where everyone was like, what just happened? What the hell? Like, what is that? Let's see here. A good chunk of Operation Kill Crush is published. I hope you like it. I've used editing more on it than past projects. Cool. Man, with the success of Kingdom Come Deliverance, I really want an RPG about the Crusades. None of this medieval Crusades bullshit. I just want to give me something neutral. Yeah, this is something I noticed. So, my very first book that I wrote, way back when I was like 19, was about the Crusades. It was a historical fiction book about the Crusades because I've been kind of fascinated with them. So here's one of the things I figured out. Histories of the Crusades written prior to World War II are very accurate and neutral. They do not cast the Crusaders as like holy, wonderful warriors, nor do they look at them as evil invaders because there's so much context there. You guys have to remember, if you know, but since then, you know, anytime I read a history of the Crusades, it's almost always from the perspective that the Crusaders are the bad guys, and that whoever is fighting the Crusaders are the good guys defending their homeland. If you actually know the history, in most cases, especially after the First Crusade, those who were fighting the Crusaders were not fighting for their home turf. They were part of empires that were outside of the Holy Land, fighting, you know, the Latin kingdoms, which are inside the Holy Land. And so it becomes a very, very interesting thing to look at that. So older histories of the Crusades to me are so much more accurate. It's become a thing where like, it's so hard to find any kind of thing where there's conquest of Europe, of another area or culture, that hasn't been completely degraded into some sort of evil thing. Even when it was, you know, those were historically Roman lands, Byzantine lands. They'd been under Roman control for over 1,000 years when the First Crusade happened. And so from their perspective, they were retaking the Holy Land, not taking it. So this idea like, oh, they came in and just took it away from the Palestinians, like this completely modern interpretation of it. It's really annoying that you can't get accurate history on that kind of stuff anymore. You have to read old stuff. And the oldest stuff was all in Latin, and therefore difficult to access, but was written very accurately. In an old interview, Rian Johnson said if he had the opportunity to make Star Wars films, he would purposely make it where the audience is split between loving it or hating it. Well, I mean, he did that. And then when Luke threw his father's lightsaber, I actually laughed. I laughed because I didn't expect that. After the movie, I realized how stupid I must have been. I thought it was funny, but it wasn't. I actually laughed a little bit at it too. Not not because I thought it was a good joke, right? Kind of the way that you laugh when, like, let's say you pop a tire, right? And you pull over, and when you pull over into a spike strip that the police have forgotten to take away, and all four of your tires pop, and you laugh. It's kind of like these things. Like, if you don't laugh, you'll cry. It was just like, he just threw it over his shoulder. Of course he did, right? That's what I would do. That to me felt like Mark Hamill going like, "This is stupid," This movie's dumb. so, I did laugh at it a little bit, Pretty sure the Crusades were white people's response to being slaves to Arabs for 4 centuries. I think it. Yeah, I don't know about that. Right. The Reconquista. That's in. So this is the other thing about the Crusades. You're like, the Crusades were all centered on Jerusalem and all these areas in the Mediterranean East. No, there was Crusades in the Iberian Peninsula, the Reconquista. In fact, the Order of the Knights Templar was very, very important in the reconquering of Spain and the expulsion of the Moors. That was considered an actual theater for real crusades, but we just kind of ignore it because it doesn't quite fit the narrative, and also because it hasn't changed hands since then. It's been under the control of Iberian people since then. So we just kind of tend to forget about that. We tend to forget about Ferdinand, King Ferdinand, and all that he did towards the end of that as well. Have you seen Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and what did you think? Historical inaccuracies aside, is my favorite Robin Hood because it's the first one I saw. I enjoy it as a movie. I think it's actually a really fun and well-made movie. It has some weird things. Like, I'm going to take out his heart with a spoon. Of course, like the sheriff trying to just rape. That was like go really overboard with criminals in some cases, or in bad guys in some cases. But overall, I enjoyed it. I remember there being a criticism that Kevin Costner didn't speak with an English accent in the movie. And I was like, well, if they didn't speak English then, right? Like, they didn't speak English. They spoke Middle English. They were really speaking a different language during the time of Robin Hood. So who cares about the accent? Yeah, Alan Rickman had a British accent. Other people did. Kevin Costner didn't. Like, it didn't bother me at all because I knew that you're just hearing it in English, right? They weren't speaking English if you were going to think about some historical Robin Hood character. Most Robin Hood characters come from, they're mostly based on Ivanhoe these days anyway. But yeah, I enjoyed it. It's a pretty well-made movie. I don't always look for historical accuracy in a movie. Like, I think Braveheart is a well-made movie that's way historically inaccurate. And because Robin Hood's kind of a mythical character, really, it's okay to not be totally historically accurate. It doesn't bug me. And believe me, I'm a pedant. I know when things are off, and I just usually let it go. It doesn't bother me that much. The only time it bothers me is when they say we've made this movie to be as historically accurate as possible, and it's not. Most of the time they're not. They're just trying to make a movie. There's ones that actually kind of do bother me. Like, I remember this Ridley Scott movie called I think it was called Gods and Kings, like Exodus, Gods and Kings, and they had very very European Egyptians and very European non-Mediterranean people playing Jews. Now, historically in Hollywood, you had people like Chuck Heston playing Moses, right? A Jew, a Hebrew. He doesn't really look Hebrew. He looks Western European, but all the actors were Western European. There was very few people that, even though there were Jews in Hollywood, most of them are Ashkenazim. They're Eastern European Jews. They don't look like probably what Mediterranean Jews would look like even today. So you had guys that were just looked white, and you didn't really think that much about it because everybody looked white, right? Egyptians probably didn't look too different from other Mediterranean peoples back then, but it was just like one of those funny things of like, well, they just cast white actors for it. Okay. And then they had these leaf shaped swords that they had that were really nice. I'm like, no, they would have had Bronze Aged Khopesh swords, right? Everything in it was just off. It was just like no attempt to maintain anything close to what it actually would have looked like when Moses was in Egypt. It was kind of one of those funny things. It was like the number of things that kept showing up was just like, this is dumb. This is now a fan. And then the way he treated the biblical story as like Moses being crazy and having like drug visions or something was just stupid. It's like you can't decide. If you're going to tell an Exodus story and just ignore history, then just tell the religious story, man. Like why try to put some weird layer of atheism on top of it? This is what Jack Cool says. I personally think history tanked after World War II because a certain someone got very interested in narrative dominance at the time. Oh, yes, but we won't talk about that on YouTube. Maybe on some other platform, right? And there's so much that you could talk about with that. It's not just that certain someone. It's really, Soviets, it's communists. They really want to rewrite the history in a way that makes people feel better about the modern creations of socialism being superior to the historically derived and evolved social and political institutions that came before that. Like World War I and World War II were, in many cases, depending on how you want to analyze it, they were created by the modern sensibility that you can remake what has come before and do it better. And the result was millions of people dying, right? So these political ideologies were new. The socialism in the United States under FDR was all new ideas of we can do it better than it has been before. And the results were horrendous in a lot of cases. And places like the USSR that went fully socialist, it was terrible there. And Nazi Germany that went full socialist, it was terrible there. And those were all things that were new. Now, Nazism is weird. I don't want to get on too many tangents with it because it also has this weird harkening back to romantic ideals of Germanic identity from the 19th century. So that's a weird one, but the point is that it wasn't just naturally evolved, which is what you had prior to the Enlightenment, I would say. Enlightenment's a lot about wiping away what was there. Yeah. Molyneux has a great talk about the Crusades. His is good. Yeah, he definitely has a good one. A very big counter narrative to what you're usually told and what you usually get with games and movies, which is that, Frank's bad. Those evil Franks that came in and did all that bad stuff. Richard the Lionheart's really a bad guy and is also gay. That's the new one. It's like, what? Come on. Richard the Lionheart? No. Come on. There was also crusades in the north aiming at the pagan lands of what today would be called Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine. Also good. There was the Teutonic Order was big up there, if I remember correctly, but I haven't studied that one as much, so I'm not going to speak too much about it, Raphael. But it's a great thing to remember too. You mentioned Knights Templar. It depresses me to see Hollywood turn the Knightly Order into a Ku Klux Klan knockoff. Read a damn book, Hollywood. Yeah. The Knights Templar can't be a knockoff of the KKK. The Knights Templar was originally called, there were two orders originally, and you should know both of them if you're going to study history. One was called the Hospitallers, the Knights of the Hospital. And the Poor Knights of Solomon's Temple are the Knights Templar. And they started, and their headquarters are actually the Dome of the Rock, which was turned into a Christian church for a while. And their whole idea was to escort pilgrims on their pilgrimages to the Holy Land, and then it expanded. And one of the things that is so interesting is how the Knights Templar came to an end. I won't get into it on this stream, but maybe I'll try to make some fun content on it. It's very frightening, and also, it should give anyone pause to know how the most powerful knightly order in the world disappeared because of the will of a particular king of France and his relationship with the Pope. And I will say there was a curse uttered by the last master of the temple when he was burned at the stake for heresy that came true. Very interesting if you guys want to do some reading about it. Xenoblade, yes. So Bloodrock says, I highly recommend Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2 if you're into good JRPGs with a narrative focus. Just play them in Japanese. They all have these like working class British accents on the Switch when I play Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Xenoblade Chronicles X is also cool. You can play that on the Wii U. I have that one. But I have Chronicles 2 on... I never played that one you can get on Wii, or the WiiWare one, and it's cool. Yeah, they're pretty cool. I actually don't mind the working class British accent so much. I find them kind of funny, but there's a Japanese humor to everything. Like there's a part where, out comes this artificial blade, this artificial fighter, and it's a robot that's like, I'm here to serve my master, like this anime robot, and everybody and the guy who made it is super embarrassed about it. It's a funny little thing. It's basically she's supposed to be a sex robot. They can't just say that, but you just get that. It's really funny. There's a lot of little moments like that in Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Let's see if I missed some. Okay. Somebody says, are all Hebrews, Israelites, Jews? No. So this is, if you're talking about Jewish religion, no. Right? They could convert it to Christianity. If you're talking about ethnic Semites, right? So people use the word Semite, which is an ethnic and linguistic thing, to just mean Jews. People of Jewish persuasion. So anyone that identifies as a Hebrew probably is Jewish because they might have lost that Hebrew identity somewhere in the past if their ancestors converted to Islam or Christianity, because they'd be extracted from that community. So there's a lot of in-group stuff with Hebrews, Muslims, and Christians in the Middle East, and that's for good reason. So you could be very closely related to the Hebrews if you're an Orthodox Christian from, say, Lebanon, right? But it's, what's the identity there? Well, your identity would be Orthodox Christian Lebanese, right? Not really Jewish. But there are Jews that are from Eastern Europe. And so I don't know if they were converts in the past or if they migrated and, mixed with local populations or what. That's the Ashkenazim. Most of the people that you see who are Jewish by religion and look European or Eastern European are Ashkenazim. And if you see, Mediterranean Hebrews tend to have Mediterranean features. Like, obviously, you would expect people from a certain area to look like each other because they live in the same area. So a little darker, olive skin, different hair, all right? Not this, like, straight European hair. So it's just different. Mega Jetty says Costner actually tried the accent, but it didn't work, so he dropped it. The dark aspect with the attempted rape in Jerusalem prison helps balance the lighthearted nature of Robin Hood. Interesting. Yeah. Another Hollywood tradition was casting British actors as Romans. It's because they need that. British actors, Americans interpret British accents as being of an elevated nature, being higher order. And they often think of people from the South as like their accent is indicating that they're dull-witted. So you hear someone like George W. Bush, like he was relentlessly attacked by the media for being stupid despite having multiple degrees from Harvard and Yale, like very high-level institutions. I'm sure George W. Bush is a very smart person, but he talks with the Southern accent. He was governor of Texas, so, and he even spoke Spanish with a little bit of it. He's like, hola, me llamo George Bush, kind of that sound. So Americans have this prejudice against that. Same thing if somebody has a New York accent, they tend to think that he's like a lower class Italian, right? Because we hear it in mob movies. So all these mob movies have, Joe Pesci has this New York accent, The two Utes were walking into the convenience store. It's like, it sounds lower class. You have that in Britain, but all the British actors tend to speak with received pronunciation, which I don't know if anybody actually talks in received pronunciation. Like I know Sean Bean often acts in received pronunciation, but his actual accent is like it's a different accent. That's, I don't know where he's from originally, but it's a thing. Like his normal accent is quite a bit different. Same thing with Christian Bale. Christian Bale can talk with an American accent or a received pronunciation, and then you hear him talk. He's like, "It's not professional." It's like it's there's a lot of those glottal stops that you get with, like, I don't say East London has a certain sound to it too. So when you hear East London, you think of like a Cockney sailor. It's like this Mavs thing is quite a lot of bother. It's like things. It's like, dude, do you know how to talk, right? Or somebody who, like Count Dankula, I make jokes about him because he's so Scottish that sometimes you're like, what? Because the accent will just get thick, but that's the way people talk there. And so there's a tendency to think that heavy Scottish accent indicates like some kind of weird yokel. Or hearing the country accent that like Sean Astin used in Lord of the Rings, like, what are you? What are you, his bodyguard? I'm his gardener, That's when things matter the most, that kind of country accent tends to be associated with like lower intelligence. We have the same thing in America. So if you're watching this in Europe or somewhere, somebody talks from the South and they're like, you can have a great lawyer that's from the South. I'm just a simple lawyer from hillbilly Alabama. But what we have here, that drawl tends to be associated with lower level thinking. And I have a drawl. Like I still have one because that's where I'm from. But it's a lot less pronounced because I've spent so much time away from it. Likewise, people in California sound stupid to most people, right? So the less regional your accent is, I think maybe the smarter you sound. So people from California, it's totally like, I was going to the store and then I'm looking through all of the makeup and I'm not seeing Bare Minerals. And so anyway, I talked to the girl. Gosh, she's so stupid. You get this California accent that to people who aren't from California, it makes you sound really stupid. And so occasionally I hear like Dave Cullen, who's an Irish YouTuber, he uses that for like American women. That's his like American women voice, and that's what they sound like to people who aren't from here, especially from LA. That's what everyone in LA sounds like, and they sound so stupid sometimes. It just sounds like they've never opened a book in their life. But that, for some reason, British acting schools, everyone learns that good received pronunciation. So it's like, shut up, Wesley. The way Patrick Stewart tends to talk. Tea, Earl Grey, hot. Hot. That big O's, all those things that make good received pronunciation. Yeah, the word Jew comes from Judah. This is what Bloodrock says, the dominant tribe of Israel. Yeah, all the lost tribes lost their identity. Those that escaped into Judah became absorbed into the Jewish ethnicity. Yeah, that's interesting. Also very interesting. But we tend to think of Jewish as the Jewish faith, is what I was thinking. And not all, so not all Jews are Hebrews, obviously. That was my point. The studded leather made him look like a realistic fantasy hero. It's a good one. Abraham was a Hebrew, but not a Jew or an Israelite. Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah. We're so separated. We're thousands of years after these events. So it's hard to know how ethnicities change or get absorbed or how cultures get transmitted with specific things. One of the things that I've been seeing lately is that genes, like people tend to not interbreed as much as it was assumed. So like the Normans conquered England and there's not a whole lot of Norman DNA. It's mostly just British Isles Celtic DNA is just kind of stuck around, the DNA of conquerors doesn't seem to end up where they conquered. It tends to leave with them for whatever reason. Not as much in other words, tribes don't intermarry as much as we tend to think they do. So chances are the people who are historically Jewish are still pretty ethnically close just because their cultures remained. But I don't know. Can't speak for the Ashkenazim. Nazism wasn't naturally evolved, neither was the Weimar Republic. Yeah, you're correct. Max Boyvin's correct. Nazism has this harkening back to a romantic vision of German identity, which was constructed as well. German identity wasn't this pagan identity that a lot of people associate with Nazism. And it's so complicated. I don't want to talk about it on this stream. I'm sure this will get demonetized because I said Nazism and Jew, but I didn't say anything bad about him. So when I first saw Fellowship of the Ring, the battle at Emon Hin at the end reminded me of the Battle of Sherwood Forest from Prince of Thieves. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I like that. Jack Cool says, I'm of German extraction. Big surprise. Nazism has no resonance whatsoever because it's so obviously anti-Christian. Yeah, Nazism is constructed. There's a couple of content creators who've made content on this. One of them is actually Rocking Mr. E, or Rocking Philosophy. He's made several pieces of content kind of deconstructing this myth that Nazism was bound up in like traditional German values or something like that. It's like that wasn't really the case as far as I know it. Now, I mean, Germans can correct me, but the way I have interpreted it is that Nazism itself is a constructed ideology and not really naturally German at all. Yeah, because I have to remember that like Germans stopped being pagan like 1500 years ago, right, with the Gothic emperors. So how can you remake identity that's so far removed? I mean, you had Julian the Apostate, the Roman emperor, try to be pagan again, and people didn't accept it because he didn't really know what it meant. It had lost its meaning once you lose it and become Christian. The paganism, like what does it mean? All you're left with is like the folk traditions. Those have just local meaning for the most part. Here we go. Funny you mentioned lawyers. In The Devil's Advocate, Keanu's lawyer's character is from Florida, and he has to sound commanding and convincing. Yeah. I like Devil's Advocate. That was a cool movie. I don't know. It kind of lost it at the end, but it was really effective up to then. I'm out of tea, which means I probably need to end this stream. It's 8 o'clock. Have you played the Talos Principle, a puzzle game from Crow Team who made Serious Sam? I have not. Any opinion on the fate of the 10 tribes? None. I don't know enough about it. I know some people believe that that like the Romans wiped out all the original Hebrews. I don't think that actually happened, but I don't know. I'm not knowledgeable enough to answer that. Other people probably know more than me. Christian Bale has a very mixed accent due to living in America for so long and trying to keep his English accent. Gary Oldman said to have lost his English accent and had to have a dialect coach to help him get his accent back. I know Mel Gibson stopped talking with an Australian accent at some point. So what do you read when it comes to Christianity? Where do you find your foundation for Christianity? So I'm originally Mennonite. That's the foundation. What do I read? I read anything that comes across that has a perspective. Right now I read a lot more Orthodox, if I can find it. Orthodoxy and Heterodoxy is a interesting book to read, one that I read from the Orthodox perspective kind of recently. So yeah. Unicorn on the Cob. Have you noticed how everyone understands the concept of white people without problem when they're crapping on whites, but when it comes to anything positive about whites, suddenly people play there's no such thing as white people deconstruction game. Yeah, I noticed that. It's like, white people are bad. It's like, well, what does white people mean? They're like, you. Like, okay, well, all right. What about this thing? That's good. It's like, well, that's the Iberian people. It's not whites. The other thing about like some racist whites, like white supremacists, I guess. I hate to use the word white supremacist, but dudes like, I don't know, Baked Alaska, like pan-racialists. Well, let's use pan-racialists. They'll change the definition of white to just fit whatever they want. They're like, Greeks are not white. All of a sudden, it's like, Greeks are not white Europeans. Like, their skin they're different. Like, of course they're a different ethnicity, right? They're from a different part of the world with different things, right? But it's like Greeks and Italians are not white. Spanish people aren't white. Portuguese people are not white. It's like only people from like halfway up France up are white. That's where you get. And then in some cases, it's like, no, like Russians and Polish people, they're not white. Man, they're Asians. It's like, they'll have light skin, light eyes. We all kind of look Northern European, right? So the old definition, it used to just be Christendom, right? Europe all the way into the what people would now call the Middle East, which is really the East Mediterranean. And yeah, some people had darker skin, darker hair. Some people had lighter skin, lighter hair, depending on where they were from. So a person was a Frank, they had light skin and hair. Ooh. A person was a Greek, they had darker skin and hair. And oddly, the Byzantines, the so-called Byzantines, the people that lived in Constantinople, were primarily Greek by ethnicity, but considered themselves Romans. So that's an interesting thing too. Bloodreich says waifu test, Mithra, Pyra, or Numa. I guess Pyra. Yeah, my brother-in-law calls it Waifu Blade Chronicles. Jack Cool says I got the Jordanetics audiobook, haunting stuff. Absolutely. Jordanetics is even if you think that Vox Day is being extreme, like his arguments are pretty on point. You know, made me really reevaluate Jordan Peterson. I'd mostly just written off Jordan Peterson as like some kind of psychology guy that I don't really know what he's talking about. And then it's like, no, pay closer attention. So I paid closer attention. I went back and looked at 12 Rules for Life again, which I thought was mostly gobbledygook when I read it. Read it again, I'm like, oh yeah, there's a lot of weird things in here. And it is mostly gobbledygook. But the gobbledygook is from a perspective that I just didn't count on being there because I wasn't looking for it. Yeah. We Where Story Is No More. Rip. Oh, God, it is, yeah. Thanks for the My Cousin Vinny reference. You're welcome. I like Christopher Lee's accent. So dignified. Now, there's an interesting thing about Christopher Lee's accent. Is he rolls the R's, and this is something that English actors are, I think, taught to do because it's very clear, you know, once upon a midnight dreary, you know, like almost like a Scot, but softer. I can't probably do it right. Because if I start doing it, I start like, once upon a midnight dreary. You know, I start being like an angry Scotsman. But he rolls his R's in an interesting way that's not really typical of any English accent. But is there for proper pronunciation so that the words are very clear to understand. And it gives him a certain dignified air. The son of the hell god, Kron, cold, Necron, inscribed, sensing his death, inscribed his dark testament in 7 books. This 7th book contained the secret of his resurrection. You know, that's Christopher Lee's voiceover from a Rhapsody album. But he hits those R's in such a cool way. I really liked Christopher Lee. I'm a huge fan of Christopher Lee, actually. He's kind of like a hero. And he was a war hero. He married a model and stayed married to her for his whole life. He's a descendant of Charlemagne. He broke up an engagement because he felt like he couldn't handle noble life, and then made an amazing life for himself as an actor. He was such an honest and forthright person in his life. And a really good actor, very effective. And he decided to start recording metal albums in his 90s. That is an example we should all follow. It's never stop trying new stuff or following your passions. Just never stop doing it, and you will not leave this life with regrets. Having done volunteer work on a farm, I can safely say they're some of the nicest and smartest people I've ever met. Yeah, farming around here. I mean, there's a farm across the street, right? So I live on farms, right? I live in a neighborhood, but there's farms, there's a farm across the street. So I live in the country, and country folk, there's a skill associated with farming, and you have to have a lot of skill with it. And I can tell you there's farmers around here that drive Lamborghinis. And so farmers driving Lamborghinis should tell something to you, right? They make a lot of money doing what they're good at what they do. Anyone that can just buy a Lamborghini in the middle of the country and put it in a garage that he built, it's pretty cool, you know. Most farmers are very good at what they do, and very smart. You have to have a lot of knowledge to know how to farm. Farming's good work, and it's also usually it's in the area of mediocristan, which means you're not gonna make $1 billion doing it, but if you're really good at it, you can make a lot of money, being a doctor or a lawyer. You know, you do really well. I think I'm skipping around the chat a lot. Let's go back down. Yeah, incidentally, they called the Crusaders Franch, meaning Frank, no matter which nation they came from. That is historically accurate. So the Muslims would call them Franks, and that was, I think there's probably some layers there. Is that they knew Christians, they had Christians that lived with them and beside them and paid that tax or whatever. So they didn't want to call them Christians. They were something other, so they called them Franks, and they weren't Byzantines because those were Greeks, you know. Yeah, the Arabs and later the Muslims called the Byzantines Rum, which means Roman. Yeah, they call themselves Romans. They consider themselves Romans. Let's see here. As a kid, I took color literally and never saw someone Caucasian as white. They were technically peach. And I never saw people of African descent as black. They were technically brown. That's true. I think Stephen King makes a joke about it in one of his books. Like, yeah, I'm looking for this black guy. And they're like, a black person? You know someone who's black? And he's like, yeah. It's like, you mean brown? This guy's brown. And he's like, yes, I mean brown, right? Because no one's actually black. There's probably like a couple people who are pretty close to black. Like they're really dark. But yeah, brown. Yeah, they're brown people. And in fact, in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a large variety of skin tones too. There's really dark brown and there's not so dark brown depending on which tribe you're with, right? There's a huge amount of diversity in sub-Saharan Africa. I think black, negro, that was just a shorthand way probably from the Middle Ages describing it, or, the slave trade and things like that. Ever heard of the Legend of Heroes series? It's a series with 9 games, but with 3 arcs. Tons of world building. I haven't, but I will check it out. It sounds cool. I posted in the discussion section. Okay. Yep. Let's see. I missed something. Not racism, just talking some things literally. Yeah, totally. Don't most farmers now get subsidies? No, not around here. So here's an interesting thing. Unicorn on the cob. Don't most farmers get subsidies? So the way farming subsidies work, at least in the United States, I can't talk about any other country. The way they work here is rather than you're paid not to grow something. That's how subsidies work here. So if you grow corn, you get paid by the government to not grow corn, which artificially raises the price of corn. Now, around here, they don't do that because not only because it's basically because it's unnecessary, but we don't grow the crops that they subsidize. So corn and wheat are subsidized. Canned milk, for some reason, subsidized. What they do is they pay them to make canned milk, even though no one drinks it, right? But you can use it as baby formula if you have to. I wouldn't recommend it, but so that's how they do subsidize. They pay people not to grow things. Well, I live in Central California, and so not growing something, there's no way you can make as much money not growing something as you could growing something. And that's because we can grow things other than corn and wheat. So across the street from me is an almond orchard, and right next to it is just a big bunch of grass where some cattle eat that get eaten, right? The grass-fed cattle. Now, you could turn that into an almond orchard and make plenty of money, but the farmer that has it doesn't want to do that because the almond orchard that he has makes a gargantuan amount of money. Likewise, there's a sheep farm right down the street, and the sheep just roam around in the pasture. They don't need subsidies because the wool, I guess, is valuable enough that it's easier to grow the sheep than to collect a subsidy on wheat. And then backing up to that is more orchards. There's orchards everywhere. Citrus, almonds, nuts, walnuts. You can grow walnut trees as like a permaculture thing if you wanted to. They're pretty cool. And they have great shade and they drop nuts which you can eat. But the nuts here are so valuable, there's no way you would pick a subsidy over actually doing something. If you owned a farm that could grow almonds and you had the money to invest to get the almond trees there, you would do that. Even if you paid somebody else to run the farm and you didn't know what you're doing, you'd come out way ahead compared to corn subsidies. Or being paid to grow corn that you only sell to ethanol companies. That's the other one. Like there's some corn around here, but most people just don't grow it. Corn here is like, we're going to make a corn maze in the fall and sell some corn at our stand because we don't have anything else better to do. Like, corn is not a very valuable crop around here. Have you ever read up or played Romancing the Saga series? I haven't. I'll have to look into it. Have you followed Vox and Mr. E's recent assault on Darwinian evolution? It's stuff I've said for years, but it's nice to see other Christians go for it. So I will okay, yes, I followed a little bit of it. So here's the thing about evolution, right? And I'm not going to say, one of the big problems with evolution, it's not that evolution doesn't exist in some form, but scientists or scientism type folks tend to lean really heavily on genetics as an explanation for everything. And even really good thinkers want a quote genetic explanation for everything. And they use the word genetic to mean hereditary. The thing is, we don't actually understand genetics as well as we think we do. We don't understand heredity as well as we think we do. So I've said this before. We don't know why wolves howl, right? And you can take a wolf pup, take him away from its mom, doesn't see any wolf behavior, it acts like a wolf. Where does the instinct come from? Oh, it must be genetics. You can map the genome of a wolf, and it's not fundamentally that different from a dog. And you're going to have a hard time finding genes that somehow create complex behaviors. Genes encode proteins. So right from the get-go, we don't have building blocks that can explain all the things that we witness that appear to be not the result of environmental factors. And a lot of evolution, including, if you want to get crazy, evolutionary psychology, this is what it does, tends to lean very heavily on this idea and then to just kind of say a lot of what ifs as explanation. So it tends to operate as almost in a religious sense, right? We explain things using this thing that we haven't witnessed. Like we haven't witnessed speciation. We've witnessed different kinds of evolution in microbes and different kinds of different kinds of life, but we haven't witnessed like this large scale transformation that we assume is what's working behind the scenes. So it becomes a little bit of an explanation that, just for lack of a better understanding, that's what people go to. So that's kind of my take on evolution. You can find people who know more about it than I do, but that's kind of where I get to, right? Like we know that organisms evolve because we have antibiotic resistance and things like that. So we know that there's evolution on some level. The question is, how far can we take that, and what have we actually witnessed? And we haven't witnessed a whole lot of this big transformation stuff. Not all of us farmers have Lambos. I drive a Dodge Journey. Mind you, I'm 28 with 3 kids. Yeah, good for you, man. Good for the 3 kids. Excellent job. But around here, there's farmers with Lamborghinis. Like it's a thing around here, man. Like farmers do really well. They do great. And a lot of the farmers are, they're people who immigrated from Mexico like 2 generations ago, bought a farm and then became very successful with it because they had the skills. Great success stories there. Let's jump down to the bottom. I need to get going here. Franks are Latins, yeah. Should Lulu from Final Fantasy X have ended up with Waka? Yeah, I forgot we're talking about Final Fantasy games, right? You guys just take me so far afield talking about evolution and things like that. Should Lulu from Final Fantasy X have ended up with Waka? I feel like she should have gone with Yuna for the X2. The writers say she would have held her back, but I think she would have grown with Yuna. Yeah. I don't know. I don't like Waka. I think I think he was way too silly. So I don't know. Yeah, speciation is very difficult to understand, especially with the very loose definition of species. Yeah, species is really a constructed idea. We say this is a species. It's like this is a human categorization on life, right? And one of the things that you have is gradation between different populations of the same species to where on either ends they're highly divergent from one another. It's very interesting. There's a lot of complexity there, but you're working with like old dogmas. Like the idea of a species comes from before anybody was really studying biology on the level that we are today. As C.S. Lewis says, to say something comes about by instinct is to say we don't understand where something comes from. Yeah. How would you write a pantheon? I have written one. So this is a great question by Bertie Sanders. I'm going to make this the last question. It's not to do with Final Fantasy, but I'll just answer it. How would you write a pantheon? So, pantheon of gods. Well, you look at historic pantheons. You have different gods that tend to be associated with different things that are important to the culture. So, in Europe, in European mythology, classical mythology, you had gods with different domains. Either you had maybe a god of the sky, a god of the earth, the god of the beneath the earth, or the god of the ocean. So Neptune, or Freyr, right? And Neptune and Pluto and Jupiter, right? Different gods. And then you have gods with different domains over human activities. So like Bacchus, the god of wine, Denarius, the god of money. So my pantheon starts from there. And what I used for mine, I basically made it a variation of like traditional European mythology. So there's 12 gods, the pantheon of 12, which is pan-European, if you want to go there. And each god has a different domain of human activity, rather than a physical domain like this is the god of the sky. So there's a god of art, a god of metalworking, which would be the equivalent of Vulcan. In my mythology, it's Feral, which means iron. He's the god of iron, right? God of metalworking. And so his partner is Artifia, the goddess of craftsmanship and artistry. And of course, the nations that represent, each nation tends to have a patron deity, and they fight each other. Even though they recognize the other deity is that they have a patron deity, the way that, the different cities in Athens, Athens had Athena as a patron deity. That's a very old idea. So that's one of the ones that I used. And I went from there. Now, one of the things I did is building a more complex pantheon. That's the main pantheon. There's a primordial pantheon, which this existed in Greek and classic mythology. You had goddesses like Nyx, which is night. Goddesses like heaven and earth. These are primordial, they're pre-gods in a sense. The Titans, right? So my primordial gods are gods of sensory domains. So there is a goddess of sight. There is a god of time. That is the sensation of time passing. A god of direction. A god of touch. A god of hearing. A goddess of taste. And goddess of smell. So each god or goddess has a domain that's associated with a sensory experience, because our sensory experiences construct the world. And so we go even further back, there's a central deity in my pantheon called the Dreamer, the one through which all things exist, right? The original, the God. And in essence, his creation is all of the cognizant and all of the self-aware beings in creation, which through their own combinations of these sensory ideas create the world in a literal sense they're not fully aware of. So the world is created through the thoughts and dreams of the people living in it, and it becomes permanent by a reiteration of those things. So as somebody thinks of a rock as being, it's hard, cold, all the things that make up a rock, it looks a certain way. As more people think of that within this dream space, it becomes more real. And as the beings that are created come to inhabit that which is mundane, that which has been repeated, they themselves become more separated from this primordial dream space. And then the gods and the goddesses reflect that. They're gods and goddesses. The human gods and goddesses in my world or in my universe are more concerned with human activities. Whereas if you look at the demi-humans, like the dark elves, which are kind of the original race, their gods and goddesses are associated with sensory feelings. And that's a really important aspect. It divides them. So the beings that are closer to the eternal dream, that are closer to this concept realm, the vision that the original God created, they have a different relationship with the deities. But all of them have this idea that there's some other archdeity that's separated from us, that we can't directly commune with because of how abstract his ideas are. He is the God of concepts, right? That's the Dreamer in mine. So that's how I do my pantheon. So that's a great way to explain it, right? You start with what did people do and what did people use their pantheon for? how did pantheons develop and how were patron gods worked and things like that. And then you can do your own version of that. And of course, for me, those all represent different variations of the same core philosophy, which is the idea of the concept giving birth to the mundane. That is, there's a Platonic idea. There's a thing itself, that the concepts that we access through language are things that are beyond our reach, but are things which are real and have an abiding presence on the earth through our repetition of those concepts. So I'm going to make that probably the last one. I appreciate all the chats. I really do appreciate you guys joining me. This was not a super popular Writestream, but it's okay. We may be kind of getting to where people have already gotten in a lot of their questions for these Writestreams, and we'll do more, and we'll explore more IPs as we go on. I'll do a Star Wars one at some point. So anyway, thanks for joining me as we go far afield. I appreciate it. And that's probably about it, guys. I do have a new book coming out. It's called Crown of Light. If you guys want to see the cover, I guess I'll do a cover reveal for you for sticking around so long. Let me see if I can find a cover of it, and I'll show you just what it's going to look like. It's a cover I designed, very simple. And I will, if you guys want, I'll explain how I do certain cover designs if you want to make them yourself and save a little bit of money. Mine tend to be okay-ish. There's definitely better cover designs out there. So yeah, I think this is it. Let's see here. Oh, this is what it looks like. Okay, so the book, it's a novella, technically. It's a novella. It's a very short book called Crown of Light. This will be a 99-cent short read on Amazon, and then I will have it for free on Subscribestar, and eventually you can probably grab a free copy, but it'll be a 99-cent read. Very, very simple design for the cover. Kind of eye-catching, and hopefully people click it and buy it for 99 cents and read it. This is a story that takes place in my Eternal Dream setting, but takes place further back in time and deals with some more demi-humans and introduces a race that will exist in the next full-length book called the Dryson, which are a orcish type race and a little bit different. They're not humans really at all, and they have a very unique culture that I've come up with them. And we're going to have some of our heroes go over to their lands in a very interesting adventure that I have worked out. So that's what it looks like. I really appreciate you all watching, and I will catch you guys next time. Make sure you have a great day, and leave me any suggestions for future Writestreams, or email me stu@davidvstewart.com, and I'll see you guys later.